Hello, profilers!
It's time for our weekly rendezvous.
The podcast that shares with you true cases of French crimes.
So, what's today's story about?
Today's case is another love story gone wrong. A couple's happy marriage comes under scrutiny when the husband comes home to find his wife has been attacked and she's barely breathing. Who could have done this to her? Find out on today's episode, Infernal Triangle.
Enjoy the story!
On July 15th, 2010, at 10:10 p.m., in Saint-Martin-d'Arbois, a panicked man called into the fire department. His voice trembling, he asked for help and explained that he had been robbed and that his wife was lying on the floor and she had great difficulty breathing. He then explained that there was blood everywhere and broke down in tears, asking them to come as quickly as possible.
The man explained that when he came home from work, he discovered his wife in a pool of blood, right in the middle of the kitchen. The fire department, followed by the gendarmerie, immediately rushed to the house.
When they arrived, they saw the man holding his wife in his arms, a panicked man who was biting his fingernails despite his blood-covered hands. He was kneeling beside his wife, shouting, "What have they done to you? Tell me, what have they done to you?" The firefighters immediately jump into action to save the victim. The woman was breathing, but her pulse was very weak. The gendarmes tried talking to the husband so that he can calm down and get his mind off the situation at hand. They moved him away from the scene, even though he was in a state of shock. The gendarmes noticed that the amount of blood on the floor and walls was very startling. Puddles of blood splattered everywhere. It was a true horror scene, one gendarme declared. They also saw traces of bloody hands, as if someone had tried to get up and escape. The firefighters quickly rushed the victim to the hospital, but unfortunately, she suffered cardiac arrest shortly after arriving at the emergency room. Laurence Dromard, aged 43, died at 1:20 a.m. The gendarmes told Sylvain that his wife had died, and he burst into tears. But a few moments later, he pulled himself together and explained that he was now going to find the robber who killed his wife. He explained to the investigators that money had been stolen, 1,200 euros, which he claimed was in his office, and some jewelry, but of little value in his opinion. The office was ransacked, as was the bedroom, where several drawers were on the floor. But at the time, it wasn't this that caught the gendarmes' attention, but rather the footprints, which corresponded to a size 9 shoe, which were not those of Sylvain Dromard, who wore much larger shoes. What's even more disturbing is that it's a single set of footprints. There's no second foot. According to the forensic pathologist, the victim had been attacked in an extremely violent manner, with the base of the skull fractured, along with fractures to the eye sockets, the nose, and the entire jaw. This is known as a fracas crânio-facial. The whole area above the scalp was completely ripped open. At least 9 blows were delivered to the victim, most of which targeted the face. The blows were repeated and extremely violent. The killer had lost his temper.
On July 19th, 2010, a judicial investigation was opened against the unknown person for voluntary manslaughter, and 3 days later, the autopsy report would arrive on the examining magistrate's desk.
According to the forensic pathologist, the victim had been attacked in an extremely violent manner, with the base of the skull fractured, along with fractures to the eye sockets, the nose, and the entire jaw. This is known as a fracas crânio-facial. The whole area above the scalp was completely ripped open. At least 9 blows were delivered to the victim, most of which targeted the face. The blows were repeated and extremely violent. The killer had lost his temper. The investigators explain that, generally speaking, when a burglar stumbles upon someone in the house, there may be 1 or 2 blows to the person, so that he or she can manage to escape. But it's quite rare for a burglar to lash out so violently to an unknown victim. The gendarmes have their first doubts about the burglar. The investigators asked the coroner what time Laurence Dromard received the first blow. Was her attacker a man or a woman? Was he alone? Unfortunately, the coroner was unable to answer these questions. However, he was able to define the murder weapon, stating it was a blunt object, i.e., one that can injure on impact without cutting or piercing, but still producing contusions. On the scalp, the coroner found parallel wounds, like an object that can tear. In his opinion, the weapon that could most closely resemble this object would be a metal garden tool, like a cultivator for tilling the soil. But nothing was 100% certain. The investigators would be looking for anything resembling this tool in the Dromard's home, in the surrounding vineyards, and in neighbors' garages, since they think the thief might have gotten rid of it when he fled. But for the moment, the murder weapon had yet to be found. In continuing the investigation, a second thing came to the gendarmes' attention: the burglary itself. This was no ordinary burglary, as the drawers were not turned over like a normal burglary. Objects were spread throughout the room. It was as if every room had been ransacked, and this is not the modus operandi of a conventional burglary. The police then asked Sylvain Dromard where the envelope containing the money had been hidden. The answer was surprising. The envelope was hidden in a binder on a shelf, but this shelf had not been searched by the burglar. The police put forward 2 hypotheses. The first was that the burglar had been very, very lucky. And the second, and more plausible for them, was that the burglar knew exactly where the envelope was hidden. The investigators questioned the neighbors, but no one saw or heard anything. To get to the house, you had to take a small gravel path with houses all around. What's more, the investigators thought this burglary was rather strange, since the youngest of their 2 daughters had gone to stay with her grandparents, leaving Mrs. Dromard, therefore, home alone, which was extremely rare during the year. So, it was someone who knew the family's habits and who knew the victim. With that, the list of suspects is narrowed down even further. And with all these elements put together, it starts to become really suspicious for the gendarmes. They had a theory that didn't necessarily line up with the burglary story, but unfortunately, they had no evidence for the courts. One of the gendarmes then calls in DSC, the French Department of Behavioral Sciences, and its profilers, or more precisely, behavioral analysts. They will construct a criminal profile at the crime scene, a psychological portrait of the culprit based on his modus operandi. Where did he go? Why did he go there? Why did he use this weapon? Did he bring it with him? They'll retrace the robbery, trying to get inside the criminal's head, and the DSC will confirm the gendarme's suspicions. Laurence Dromard didn't surprise the burglar going through the drawers. She was the one surprised. The target wasn't the money. The target was Laurence Dromard, and she knew her killer. The very serious wounds on her face are a form of depersonalization that characterizes many criminal cases where there's certainly a link of acquaintance between the victim and the murderer.
Laurence Dromard was a hairdresser in Saint-Martin-d'Ablois. Everyone knew her. The gendarmes will now try and figure out what exactly happened here, and, in their opinion, her assassin is closer than we think.
Her husband and her 2 daughters were the most important thing to Laurence Dromard. The eldest is 19 and the youngest 14. Sylvain was almost 52 and they had been married for nearly 20 years. Sylvain has a carpentry business and works a lot. He is also said to be strong-willed, but well-liked, helpful, and he earns a good living. Thanks to his successful business, he bought acres of vineyards and several houses. As for Laurence, she ran a hairdressing salon just opposite her home and was very well known in this small town. She was always smiling, caring, listening to people talk. She was also very well liked in the community. The day before the tragedy, she was seen in her husband's arms, looking very happy and radiant. It was July 14th, synonymous with France's national holiday. That evening, the couple went to see the fireworks, then attended the town festival where they danced and had a few drinks. They were a happy, ordinary couple, but they hadn't always been this happy, as just a few months earlier, the couple had gone through a rough patch. It's no surprise to anyone that Sylvain Dromard is a ladies' man, multiplying his female conquests without regret. He is described as a seducer and a pleasure seeker. Through his job, he gives estimates and works with several women, and he doesn't hesitate to offer sex during consultations. And he took full responsibility for his infidelities, even in front of his wife.
Laurence, for her part, wanted to keep her husband and children at all costs. She didn't want conflict and preferred to turn a blind eye to her husband's infidelities. On July 15th, like every Thursday, Laurence was working in her retirement home. Her hairdressing salon was closed and the suitcases were packed.
The family had planned to go on vacation, to forget their worries and relax, heading for the sun and the beach. Everyone was excited to leave, and the whole family was thrilled. Sylvain's testimony gives the same version as the witnesses, but Sylvain Dromard leaves the gendarmes rather perplexed, as during questioning, his BAC, or blood alcohol content, was over the legal limit. He had been drinking. He was then examined by a doctor who noticed marks on his right arm and the right side of his groin. The gendarmes explained to Sylvain that they were going to have to photograph his injuries. And when he took off his clothes, the gendarmes were shocked by Sylvain's evil, menacing look. The investigators start to wonder about this man's attitude. They asked him what he was doing on July 15th. Most victims, when confronted with this question, get very upset because they are psychologically damaged. They are crushed and they don't remember their whole day.
However, Sylvain Dromard repeated his schedule with a precision that shocked the investigators, who found it very unusual. But what does Sylvain Dromard say about his schedule at the end of the day, the time that interests the gendarmes the most?
He explained that he closed his warehouse at 6 p.m. in Saint-Martin-d'Ablois, that he went home quickly and then passed by a customer's house to make an estimate in a nearby town, and that he returned home at 8:30 p.m. His wife was there, watering the garden. He had another estimate to do in a nearby town, and he asked his wife to come with him, but she declined, explaining that the suitcases weren't quite ready for the next day, and that she'd rather stay home and finish everything so that it was ready for their vacation. So he left alone for Épernay, the nearby town, and when he returned home at 9:50 p.m., he found his wife lying on the floor in a pool of blood. At 10:10 p.m., he called the fire department, 20 minutes after discovering his wife. The investigators checked everything out, and it all lines up. Or at least, almost everything, since one small detail doesn't exactly support Sylvain Dromard's statement. Mrs. Dromard was in fact gardening, but according to a neighbor, it was 7 p.m. She's sure of it because every day this neighbor arrives home from work at 7 p.m. She says hello to Mrs. Dromard, then goes for a walk in the neighborhood and returns home around 7:45 p.m. And at that time, Mrs. Dromard was no longer in the garden. Another thing that intrigues the gendarmes, a witness confirms to police that he had seen Sylvain Dromard at 9:10 p.m. in the street of Saint-Martin-d'Ablois, behind the wheel of a car, wearing a white t-shirt with small black stripes on his sleeves. However, the gendarmes recover video footage from a bank surveillance camera, which the man had visited that very morning, July 15th, wearing a black t-shirt. The investigators then asked him if he had changed clothes during the day, to which he replied, no. During the first interrogation, one of the gendarmes asked Mr. Dromard if all was well in his relationship. He answered yes, that he's happy, but then went on to explain to the gendarmes that he had a mistress, Muriel Bonin. The police then dig deeper in this direction, trying to find out a little more about his extramarital relationship.
Muriel Bonin is a 46-year-old executive secretary who has been married for 10 years. She worked in a building company the same one where Sylvain Dromard came to buy his equipment. That's how they met. Sylvain Dromard had many mistresses, but with Muriel, it was different.
Mr. Dromard put Muriel up in one of his apartments, in the same town as his main house where he lived with his wife, Laurence. But the two women put pressure on him, telling him he had to choose between them. He left Muriel 3 times to devote himself to his wife, but it never lasted for long, returning each time to his mistress. The last time was in April, 4 months before the murder. The police discovered that not only did Muriel and Laurence know each other, they also hated each other. Just 3 months before the tragedy, the mistress filed a complaint against Laurence, Sylvain Dromard's wife. On April 24th, 2010, Laurence had come to the mistress's house to explain herself. The explanation degenerated as Laurence asked Muriel to stop seeing her husband, explaining that she was his wife, before calling the mistress a whore. Muriel then lost her temper, slapped her across the face, and grabbed her by the hair. Mrs. Dromard responded with violent blows, which left Muriel with bruises, and she even had to stay home from work for 7 days. In Muriel Bonan's statement, it says that Mrs. Dromard had always wanted to destroy their relationship and said she would never leave them in peace. She made numerous threats, which she never carried out. Muriel says she doesn't understand why Laurence Dromard came to her home, just so she could fight her. And for the gendarmes, it could be just the motivation one needed to murder a nuisance. Then, 3 weeks after the crime, Muriel Bonan was brought down to the station and questioned by the gendarmes. Muriel is a person who likes to talk a lot and is very seductive. Muriel seems to have prepared everything and expected to be asked about her schedule on July 15th, 2010. But the investigators are smart and will start with the events of July 14th, the previous day, during the national holiday. She didn't remember that day, but on the evening of July 15th, she knew her schedule down to the last detail. She went on to explain that she had absolutely nothing to do with this affair, but she was very afraid of being suspected by the police. She then stated, without having any concrete explanation for why, that she threw her phone into the Marne purely out of fear. The Marne River is 20 kilometers from Saint-Martin-d'Arbois.
The investigators will seize this opportunity even if it's a long shot. A team of divers arrive on the scene to search for this famous phone, which could well provide new evidence for this case.
Just a few hours after the search, the phone was found, without a SIM card, broken and burnt. At first glance, the phone was unusable, but thanks to the experts, they were able to salvage and explore the phone's internal memory, a goldmine for the investigators. Messages were manually deleted, but the investigators were able to trace some of the text messages that Muriel Bonan sent to Sylvain Dromard on July 1st, 15 days before the tragedy, and the messages were chilling to read.
I thought she was out of commission. You told me before the 17th, didn't you? If we support each other, yes. You'll need me, and I'll need you. Unless nothing happens, then that's another matter. Tell me tomorrow what you really want to do with her.
These text messages were not sufficient evidence to accuse Muriel Bonin, but the investigators began to wonder about her involvement in the case. The detectives were thinking of two potential suspects, the husband and his mistress. The gendarmerie then placed the two under surveillance, tapping their phones and scrutinizing all the detailed invoices and bills. The first important point to note, during his interview, Sylvain Dromard stated that he had not heard from Muriel Bonin since his wife's death. But he was lying, as the gendarmes discovered thanks to the telephone bills. On July 15th, the evening of the tragedy, the gendarmes investigated the scene and dropped Sylvain off at his brother's house the next morning.
And the first person he called was Muriel, his mistress, at 5:11 in the morning. But over the next few days, they continued to keep in touch as well. She called him several times on one of her friend's phones, and also used 3 SIM cards in 6 different phones. But she wasn't the only one to cover her tracks, as Sylvain Dromard also used similar methods, using his customers' cell phones, his company's phone, as well as a phone booth.
But unfortunately for him, he made his first mistake. It occurred on July 29th, 2010, when he left a message on Muriel Bonin's mobile, the phone she had disposed of in the river, and whose data the police had managed to recover. In this message, he tells her, "I don't understand. I've still got your answering machine. There's been a tragedy at home. I don't understand." As if Muriel Bonin didn't know about the death of Sylvain Dromard's wife. And the police immediately understand that, in the end, the message was not for Muriel, but for the police themselves. Dromard was trying to cover his tracks. It's now been 4 months since Laurence Dromard's death, and the lovers talk regularly and also see each other in secret. Muriel Bonin would drive around in a grey Volkswagen, a car that's quite rare on the road. One day, this vehicle was spotted in a hotel parking lot in Reims. Sylvain Dromard's car was also there. Sometimes they used their real names.
Sylvain Dromard is the head of his company with a certain ease in management, a strong ego, and a touch of manipulation. He would also develop this strategy on one of the policemen. And this police officer will play into his game. He tries to pass himself off as a weak police officer to gain Sylvain's trust. He decides to let himself be manipulated.
He allows himself to be manipulated in an attempt to obtain information, and thus gain time to give the other investigators working in the field a chance to find new evidence. During the interrogation, Sylvain Dromard indirectly encouraged the investigators to look into Muriel Bonin's case, and that's exactly what the gendarmes are going to do. They're going to try and reconstruct her schedule thanks to the data that was recovered on her phone. And it's there that they find something rather unusual, since during the week, she generally starts work in the morning at around 6 a.m. and finishes in the evening at around 10 p.m. But on the night of the crime, she switched off her phone early in the evening. On that day, Muriel Bonin made an unscheduled visit to see a friend, but to no avail, as her friend was away. But then again, Muriel never visited her friends unannounced.
For the investigators, something wasn't adding up, especially since 3 days later, Muriel phoned her friend to ask a favor. She wanted her friend to say that they'd had dinner together the night Muriel dropped by, and therefore the night of the murder.
But she didn't stop there, as she also asked her brother for a strange favor. She explained that some time after Laurence Dromard had been attacked in her home, she had consulted sites selling weapons, and to avoid any problems, she asked her brother if he could delete everything from her computer. She was afraid that the investigators would ask questions, even though she said she's done absolutely nothing with this case. Another surprising fact would also alert the detectives. On June 8, 2010, Muriel went to Decathlon, a sporting goods store. There, she bought a baseball bat. And it didn't take long for the investigators to make the connection with the medical examiner's description of the murder weapon as a blunt, heavy, and very solid object. Even if the parallel marks are missing, a baseball bat could fit the bill. And the last troubling thing for the detectives, Muriel Bonin wore a size 39 shoe, a size that could match the bloody footprints found in the Dromard house on the night of the murder. 4 months after Laurence Dromard's murder, her husband Sylvain Dromard and his mistress Muriel Bonin are both taken into police custody in order to understand what happened and who killed Laurence Dromard. Her husband, Muriel Bonin, or both of them together. This was going to be complicated for the investigators for several reasons. The first was that the two lovers, after so many months, have certainly practiced their interrogation skills and no doubt worked out their story. And the second, and most important, was the lack of any concrete evidence, only suppositions and hunches.
Sylvain Dromard is the first to be questioned. The investigators ask him a lot of questions, often the same ones but reformulated in different ways, but he never gives the wrong answer and is extremely precise. He never cracks, even when they ask him to explain inconsistencies in his schedule. It's simply a mistake, he confirms.
He has no recollection of telephone exchanges with Muriel. He never hid his hotel meetings with his mistress after his wife's murder. He exudes such confidence that the investigators are stunned. Even when they ask him, on the night of the murder, why it took him 20 minutes to call for help when his wife was dying, he stuck to his original story, explaining that he couldn't find the home phone. So he had to leave the house to go to his truck to fetch his cell phone. For the investigators, 20 minutes is an exaggeration, given the seriousness of his wife's injuries. Meanwhile, Muriel Bonin is also being questioned by the investigators, and she too is very well prepared, resisting all questions. It's a really tough interrogation for the detectives. Sylvain Dromard and Muriel Bonin are extremely gifted and clever at handling the interrogation. The investigators have had 47 hours in custody, and they've got nothing. They have 1 hour left before releasing the lovers. Muriel Bonin's investigator will try to play his last trump card. A few hours before the interrogation, Muriel's gray car was inspected and stains were found inside. But the police don't yet know what these stains correspond to. The investigator then sets a trap for Muriel Bonin. He asks her what the stains are. She asks the investigator, "Are they traces of blood?" The investigator stares at her without answering. And then Muriel Bonin starts to panic, afraid that her lover is manipulating her and that he may have placed the bloodstains in her car. Panicked, she fears she'll be accused of murder while Sylvain Dromard goes free, especially as she believes the detectives have more evidence against her than against Sylvain. Muriel Bonin has fallen into the investigator's trap. In the final interview, Muriel Bonin explains that she knew the details of what had happened and that it was Sylvain Dromard who had assaulted his own wife. According to her, Sylvain told her the story, explaining that he hit his wife once with the baseball bat, but Laurence didn't fall down. He looked her in the eye and hit her repeatedly until she lost consciousness. After that, he went to his warehouse to drop off the baseball bat and change his clothes. According to Muriel Bonin, this woman was not attacked at 10 p.m., but rather late in the evening. He had organized the whole thing, took jewelry from his home, staged a burglary, and went to throw the jewels into a pond. He then went to a restaurant owner's place to make an estimate, which was to serve as his alibi. But when Sylvain Dromard returned home, his wife was still alive, whereas he had thought she was already dead. He panicked and explained to Muriel that he was afraid his wife had had time to mark the killer's name in blood. He had to finish her off, and to do so, he used a rag to suffocate her. He later explained to the firemen that he had performed several compression stitches on his wife to try and stop the bleeding, using the famous rag. For the detectives, there was no doubt. Muriel Bonin was telling the truth. According to them, the narrative is fluid. There's no hesitation. She's freeing herself of a weight. But the most important thing for the detectives is that she has just denounced not only a murder, but an assassination orchestrated by none other than Sylvain Dromard himself, and that it was indeed premeditated.
On the other hand, detectives are still wondering about Muriel's involvement, as she tells the story in great detail, for someone who wasn't there. She admits that the plan was put together by the two of them, and that she bought into it and knew the whole story before it happened. But she still insisted that Sylvain Dromard acted alone, because he didn't want her to take part, since he wanted to protect her.
She spent about 50 minutes on the phone with Sylvain Dromard, from 5 p.m. to 5:50 p.m., and he explained that he wasn't feeling well. He had a lump in his stomach, and that he had drank a little alcohol to give himself courage. She also noticed that the baseball bat she had at home had disappeared, and immediately realized that this is the night it's all going to go down.
Before the murder, Sylvain Dromard went to see his notary to ask him how much a divorce would cost. And the sum was immense. For the investigators, this may well have been Sylvain's motive, as money was important to him, and it may well have been what prompted him to take action. the price of divorce. In the meantime, Sylvain Dromard has been charged with murder. As for Muriel Bonin, she is also charged with complicity in murder. The two lovers end up in prison.
A team of divers searched the area for several days, but no jewelry was found in the pond. This poses a problem, since the missing jewelry will never be found. This story, told by Muriel Bonin, starts to lose credibility. Another problem arose: the murder weapon. The coroner had noted small parallel marks on Laurence's wounds, associating the weapon with the shape of a metal cultivator with multiple prongs. But so far, investigators haven't found the murder weapon. A baseball bat might be a match, even if that's not how the coroner described the weapon. The mistress tells the investigators that Sylvain Dromard hid the baseball bat in the false ceiling of his business, along with his blood-stained clothes. Upon arrival at the scene, in the presence of Sylvain Dromard, it's not necessarily the baseball bat that the investigators are looking for, but rather traces of blood left by clothing as well as by the murder weapon, whether it be a baseball bat or a gardening tool. The investigators analyze Sylvain Dromard's behavior. He's a man who demands a coffee, who is pretentious toward the police. He believes that in his workshop, even with handcuffs on his wrists, he's the boss. But when the gendarmes approached the false ceiling, the husband's demeanor changed, and one of the investigators described a man who became anxious and much less confident than at first. After an analysis with a UV light, the gendarmes noticed traces, which they immediately lifted and sent to the laboratory, hoping that they might be traces of blood. But still no weapon, no gardening tool, no baseball bat. A few minutes later, another disappointment for the investigators. The stains found at the scene weren't blood, but the officers were about to make a great discovery. In one corner of the false ceiling, they saw a hole. The investigators questioned the employees, and one of them said that Sylvain Dromard had told him that in mid-July he had fallen through the false ceiling while getting carpentry materials. But the investigators see another explanation. Sylvain Dromard had come to hide the baseball bat and had indeed fallen through the false ceiling, which would explain the wounds on his body, which the police officers wanted to photograph during questioning. But no one could find the bat. The gendarmes go back to Muriel Bonin, who has a new explanation to give them. According to her, he left the baseball bat for 2 or 3 days before slicing it up in his workshop and burning it in the vineyard. And when Muriel Bonin finishes her sentence, it's the trigger for the officers: the vineyard. A witness who had been interviewed a few days earlier claimed to have seen Sylvain Dromard's car in the vineyards on July 18th, not far from his home. But the thing was that it wasn't his vineyard, so it had no business being there. So the investigators immediately set off in the direction of the vineyard. When they arrived at the scene, they made a remarkable discovery. They found an area where a number of objects had been burnt, including shoe eyelets and shoe soles partially charred.
These shoes, could that be the shoes that left the bloody prints found in the kitchen? But who would have used these shoes? Sylvain Dromard, in order to cover his tracks? Muriel Bonin? who perhaps came to burn them here. And let's not forget that it was also Muriel Bonin who bought the bat. The investigators ask themselves a lot of questions, and the mystery remains impassive.
The investigators now turn their attention to Muriel Bonin's case, and the judge authorizes a search of her home. Without further ado, the gendarmes arrived on the scene, and the first discovery was a baseball bat. A great find for the investigators. But after a quick analysis, the baseball bat had 0 marks. It was practically brand new, so it can't be the murder weapon. And Muriel Bonin, once again, offers an explanation. When Sylvain Dromard took her bat, she panicked and decided to buy another one. The investigation becomes difficult. The two lovers have a motive. They both lied. The charges against Sylvain Dromard are Muriel's confession, the fire in the vineyard, and the wounds on his body. The charges against Bonin are the purchase of the bat, her shoe size, and her infamous fight with her rival. A perfect tie. But who killed Laurence Dromard? The investigation will now shift focus to the personalities and behavior of the two lovers, as well as their relationship, in an attempt to find the culprit. What really united the two lovers as a couple? They took real pleasure when they made love together. Nothing else.
During his interrogations, Sylvain Dromard would never hint at a relationship of tenderness or affection with his mistress. It was purely sex that interested him. In fact, he stated that they were the best freeholds he could find, a phrase that particularly shocked the investigators, showing that Sylvain Dromard had no sentimental attachment whatsoever to his mistress.
Experts speak of Sylvain Dromard as a very egocentric person with narcissistic impulses. He's the center of the world, and everyone around him is at his service. And his first victim of mood swings was his mistress. Sylvain Dromard is an extremely jealous man. When he calls his mistress and she doesn't answer right away at work, he arrives on site to cause a scandal. He considered his mistress to be an object, his object. In the investigation file, there's a love letter from Muriel Bonin to Sylvain, and she declares, "I don't judge you. I admire you. I respect you. Come back to me quickly, very quickly."
Specialists see this as a fascination on the part of the mistress, as if she were saying to herself, "He killed her for me. He killed his wife for me." They can also see something else in this letter: fear. But the experts don't really believe in Muriel Bonin's submissive, impressionable side. And they even wonder, in the end, who's manipulating who.
After several days in prison, without seeing each other, the judge decides to confront the two lovers. In an ideal scenario, the judge was hoping for a confession to a crime of passion, that Sylvain Dromard would confess to the murder of his wife, and that he would confess to Muriel that he had killed his wife to prove his love for her, to ask her forgiveness, and to tell her that he loved her. But the reality is totally different. The two lovers definitely stick to their story. Miss Bonin continues to explain the same story with as much detail as ever. As for Mr. Dromard, he continues to deny all allegations. He keeps declaring, "There's no proof." After 1 year in detention, Muriel Bonan and Sylvain Dromard are released, but remain under investigation. The judge will then order a reconstruction of the scene. He wants to know if the evidence gathered by the investigators at the crime scene and at the psychological level matches the scene on the night of the murder. And to optimize the results, he calls in a specialist, a blood analyst, who can analyze the traces of blood. On July 3rd, 2013, 3 years after the murder of Laurence Dromard, everyone gathered in the house for the reconstruction of the crime scene. Traces of blood are still present, creating a very unique atmosphere inside the house. Miss Bonan categorically refuses to enter the house, as she insists she had nothing to do with the murder. When she arrives on scene, she feels sick, exhausted, and anxious. The blood analyst will now analyze the crime scene, looking at the bloodstains and trying to reconstruct the scene. According to her, the victim took the first blow, which made her bleed. The second and subsequent blows occurred when the victim was on the ground. The victim tried to stand up several times, but to no avail. Now it's Sylvain Dromard's turn to reconstruct the scene, explaining how he found his wife, how he tried to save her life. He explains the whole scene in detail, incredibly sure of himself. The only problem is that his lawyer is much less sure of the story.
During the reconstruction, Sylvain Dromard makes several mistakes. He explains that he's going to use a cloth to wipe the blood off his wife's head, then wring it out immediately afterwards.
And when he goes through the motions, he realizes himself that there are no traces of blood that match wringing out the cloth. His lawyer comes to his defense, explaining that the night he saw his wife, he was under stress, full of adrenaline, and that it's impossible for him, months later, to mimic the scene with near-perfect accuracy. But despite this, Sylvain Dromard makes a second mistake. He had explained to the policeman that he hadn't called 911 immediately because he couldn't find the landline, and that a few minutes later, he had realized that his cell phone was in the pocket of his jeans.
And that's when he grabbed his phone. Only thing is, his hands are bloody and there's no trace of blood in his pockets. And yet he had just wrung out the bloody cloth. According to the investigators, Dromard is totally lying. The judge decides to send the two lovers to trial, where Sylvain Dromard is the prime suspect, but without completely ruling out his mistress.
But a big problem arises for the court d'assises. There is no concrete proof Dromard murdered his wife. The details are wrong, but you can't accuse a person on details alone. Unfortunately, the prosecution has absolutely nothing against Sylvain Dromard. No murder weapon, no confession, no witnesses, just a neighbor who spotted Sylvain Dromard in the vineyards after the murder. But according to investigators, it's possible that this neighbor, an alcoholic, had an altercation in the past with Sylvain Dromard, that he went to the police several days later after having read about Dromard in the press and said that he had seen him drop things near a fire. This testimony was not at all credible in the eyes of the investigators. He also had no material evidence against Sylvain Dromard, but rather against Muriel Bonin, as she was the owner of the baseball bat, and she bought a second one to replace the first. For Muriel Bonin's lawyers, these accusations are ridiculous.
They explain that if she were involved in the murder, she would have taken more precautions. She would never have bought a baseball bat with a check if she didn't want to be spotted.
According to her lawyers, the alibi doesn't add up either, because on the night of the crime, she was home alone. So if she had premeditated a murder, she would have arranged to spend the evening at a friend's house in order to build an alibi at the very moment when Sylvain Dromard was committing the murder of his wife. And behind every accusation against Muriel Bonin, we always find Sylvain Dromard. He's the one who asked her to throw away her phone. It was he who came to pick up the baseball bat. According to Miss Bonin's lawyers, Mr. Dromard wanted to implicate his mistress.
They explained that, as a carpenter, he had all the tools he needed to kill his wife, and that he didn't need to come and get the baseball bat.
With no evidence, and the lovers denying any involvement in the murder, it's up to the 9 jurors to come up with a verdict on the basis of their personal convictions. On February 3rd, 2016, the trial opened in the court of Reims. But the main defendant, Sylvain Dromard, was missing. 2 days earlier, he had an appointment with his lawyer to work out the final details in order to improve his defense case. But on the way home, he had a serious accident on the freeway, his car sliding under a big truck.
A serious accident, since he suffered several fractures to his body. Some people even think it was a suicide attempt to escape judgment. In reality, there aren't many people left in his life. He has a lot to lose, including the love of his 2 daughters, who for the moment are supporting him while he awaits the verdict of the courts.
The president then postpones the trial, despite the presence of Muriel Bonin. The journalist then asked her a question. In your opinion, there's no doubt that he killed Mrs. Dromard. After a moment of silence, she answered, Yes, there's no doubt, and I'll say it again on the day of the trial. The trial is set for June 27th, 2016. Sylvain Dromard is reinstated, and he appears free, as does Muriel Bonin, present that day. A surprising scene takes place in the defendant's box. Sylvain Dromard and Muriel Bonin are sitting on the same bench, but at opposite ends. This scene clearly shows 2 people who hate each other. They don't look at each other for the whole hearing, just shrugging their shoulders. It's a surreal scene, given the past of these 2 lovers. We observe a distant, cold, impassive Sylvain Dromard, even when the coroner recounts the horrific scene, even when he sees photos, even when he is told about his wife. Nothing. He's a man without emotion. He proclaims his innocence without a single word of love for his late wife. The jurors are quite shocked by his silent, wordless demeanor. He is simply a spectator at his own trial. He's not shouting his innocence. He's just there to say he's not guilty. And for the defense, that's rather strange. But the jury doesn't understand Sylvain Dromard's motive either. His wife tolerated his infidelities. He could have had it all. His wife, his mistress. They just can't understand why he committed the act. But then, could it be money? Divorce is expensive, especially since we know how important money is to Sylvain Dromard. Wasn't killing his wife the easy way out for Sylvain? But questions keep coming up during this hearing. What role did Muriel Bonin play in this affair? Did she orchestrate Mrs. Dromard's murder? Did she help Sylvain Dromard kill his wife? Or is she totally innocent? Muriel Bonin gives an image of a woman who knows what she wants, who dominates, and yet she passes herself off as one of Sylvain Dromard's victims. But no one in the courtroom believes her. According to the public prosecutor, if it hadn't been for Muriel Bonin, Sylvain Dromard would never have committed the crime. According to the public prosecutor, Sylvain Dromard was sentenced to life imprisonment for his violent crime against his wife. Muriel Bonin was sentenced to 20 years firm imprisonment as an accomplice in the murder of Mrs. Dromard. But the defense didn't intend to give in and asked for an acquittal for the defendants, hoping to leave the courtroom free. The court is severe: 30 years imprisonment for Sylvain Dromard and 18 years of prison for Miss Bonin. The defendants disagree and do not hesitate to appeal. 1 year later, a new trial opened in the Troyes Assize Court. Handcuffs on the wrists of the two accused. Muriel Bonin has completely changed, appearing gray-haired, very thin and wrinkled. She is very marked by her time in prison. The trial lasts several days, but everything is the same as the first hearing a year earlier. The same experts, the same questions, the same troubling facts for the two defendants, but no progress. On the eve of the verdict, Dromard suddenly announces that he has some revelations to make. He explains that he ran into Muriel Bonin with her brother on the way out of the house, and that they were responsible for his wife's death. But Sylvain Dromard's statement convinced no one, not the judges, not the plaintiffs, not even his daughters. But with his last-minute revelations, the husband has lost all credibility. On the other hand, Muriel Bonin has everything to gain, since Sylvain Dromard has just become a manipulator with this attempt to accuse Muriel and her brother one final time. The jury deliberates, and the verdict is in. Sylvain Dromard is sentenced to 30 years imprisonment, but surprisingly, Muriel Bonin is acquitted. Everyone in the room is shocked. Even Muriel Bonin herself doesn't understand what's happening. She bursts into tears. She would later say that she had fought all those years for justice.
Muriel Bonin is now free and has left the region to try and start a new life. As for Sylvain Dromard, he returned to prison to serve his sentence. But a few months later, he took his own life. Thank you for watching this video.
We are excited to share these stories with you and to give a voice to the victims worldwide.
If you enjoyed this story,
you can help us out by liking the video, subscribing to our channel, and punching the notification bell.
Very important, don't forget to give us your opinions in the comments.
Thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Au revoir!